Is there any hard evidence outside of the Bible for the existence of ancient Israel's King David? For a long time, the answer was no. That is, until the discovery of the Tel Dan inscription. And with that discovery that mentions the house of David, things got a bit disputed. In this video, we look at the famed Tel Dan inscription and discuss what it says and what it doesn't say. So come on, let's go dig. Hey, welcome back to Excavator. I'm Dr. Bob Cargill, Associate Professor of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Iowa. Thanks for watching. As always, Excavator videos are sponsored by the Friends of the IAA, the Israel Antiquities Authority. Look in the notes below if you'd like to make a donation to the Friends of the IAA and help make wonderful discoveries like the Tel Dan inscription. Excavator is also made possible by JewishHistory.com. Make sure you check out all of the other wonderful digital projects exploring the history of Israel and Judaism at JewishHistory.com. In today's video, we look at the Tel Dan inscription, which is also known as the House of David inscription for reasons we'll discuss shortly. Now, what is this thing? The Tel Dan inscription is a text inscribed in Aramaic letters on a slab of prepared basalt stone that boasts of a king's conquests. The first and largest piece was discovered in 1993, with two smaller pieces that fit together with the larger piece discovered in the next archaeological season. It is 34 centimeters high by 32 centimeters wide, so about 13.5 inches tall by 12.5 inches wide. The inscription itself dates to the 9th century BCE on textual, epigraphical, and paleographical grounds. Now, for those of you who don't know, epigraphy is the study of inscriptions, and paleography is the science of studying the shapes of letters and using them to date an inscription, because the way we write letters changes over time. I mean, just look at this picture of the U.S. Constitution. You can still read it, kind of, but most of us don't write letters like that anymore. So we can date the shapes of these letters to an approximate time period in history. That's paleography, and it works for most time periods throughout history. So, the Tel Dan inscription itself dates to the 9th century BCE, but the broken fragments were discovered in reuse as part of a gate complex dating to the 8th century BCE, because even though the inscription broke 2,800 years ago, the basalt could still be used as building material. The inscription preserves 13 lines of text, and it's not known how many lines of text are missing from the beginning and the end of the original inscription. Now, we don't really know what the Tel Dan inscription originally looked like, because 3 of the sides are gone, the top, the bottom, and the left side. And remember, Semitic languages are written from right to left. It may have been a big rectangular slab, but UCLA scholar Bill Schniedewind thinks it may have been inscribed on the chest of a statue of the king making the boast in the inscription. He believes this because of the slight curve of the lines of writing and of the margins. This would make the Tel Dan inscription similar to other Northwest Semitic inscriptions, like the Zakur Stela, the Tel Fekherea inscription, the Barakib inscription from Zindrali, and the Karatepe inscription, which were also inscriptions on statues of kings making boastful victory claims. So what does this thing say? Most scholars agree on most of the letters, as most of the Tel Dan inscription is pretty clear. Where scholars disagree is on the letters that are partially broken or missing. Scholars represent these letters in brackets, and we consider those reconstructed texts, as those are usually where you'll see differences in the translation of a text. I say usually because you'll sometimes see scholars disagree about how we should interpret clearly readable texts and words as well. With that said, if we look at lines 3 through 13 of the inscription, it reads something like the following. And the king of Israel, so that's kind of a big deal right off the bat. There's a reference to the king of Israel. And the king of Israel previously entered my father's land. And Hadad, and remember Hadad is a Canaanite and specifically an Amorite storm deity who wore a horned helmet, wielded a thunderbolt, and was often known as Baal-Hadad. And Hadad made me king, and Hadad went in front of me, and I departed from the 7 somethings of my kingdom, and I slew, we think, 70 kings, maybe 2 kings, maybe mighty kings, who harnessed, we think, thousands of chariots and thousands of horses. So far, so good. We have in lines 3 and 4 what appears to be a reference to the king of Israel, who led a successful military campaign against this king's neighboring country when his father was ruling. Okay, fine. Then it gets interesting. The text also gets a little more reconstructed, but with some confidence, which I'll explain in a moment. It continues, I killed, we think, Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed, we think, Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David. And I set, we think, their towns into ruins and turned their land into desolation. And then the text gets really choppy, although there are some key words we can make out, including other, led over Israel, and siege upon at the end of the text. So what does this all mean? This particular military campaign boast is relevant to biblical archaeology because it speaks of a king, clearly the son of a king, now in power, who claims to have killed both a king of Israel and a king of the house of David, a term that appears to be a synonym for the kingdom of Judah, which we'll discuss at the end of this video. The question then becomes, who could these characters be? What neighboring foreign king who worships the Aramaean deity Hadad is credited with conquering both Israel and Judah, and with killing both of their kings in or around the mid-9th century BCE? Evidence from outside of the Bible doesn't tell us too much, but the text of the Bible actually tells us a lot about this otherwise overlooked period of time. And when we begin looking in the Bible, we find an interesting possibility that the author of the Tel Dan inscription, or at least the one who commissioned it, is King Hazael of Aram-Damascus, an Aramaean king ruling from his capital in Damascus, who reigned nearly half a century from 842 to 796 BCE, so in the 9th century, who would have spoken Aramaic. We also learn that 2 kings died during his reign, King Jehoram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, and King Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, the king of the house of David. Now, why do scholars think this? The text discusses the Aramaean king Hazael campaigning in Canaan, and it essentially says that King Joash of Judah paid Hazael off so he would let Judah survive, implying a suzerain vassal arrangement in which the lesser vassal, Judah, agrees to pay its suzerain, Aram-Damascus, a bunch of gold tribute in exchange for Hazael not, destroying them. Let's read it here. 2 Kings 12, 17 through 18 says, At that time King Hazael of Aram went up, fought against Gath, and took it. But when Hazael set his face to go up against Jerusalem, King Jehoash of Judah took all the votive gifts that Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, and Ahaziah, his ancestors, the kings of Judah, had dedicated, as well as his own votive gifts, all the gold that was found in the treasuries of the house of the Lord and of the king's house, and sent these to King Hazael of Aram. Then Hazael withdrew from Jerusalem. So Joash paid off Hazael, which means that by the time of 2 Kings 12 and the reign of King Joash, Judah was already a vassal of the Aramaean king Hazael. So whoever Hazael defeated must have reigned before Joash. Now, this is where it can get a little bit confusing So I made a handy-dandy chart to help us out. Remember, there are two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. Israel is the big, dominant kingdom to the north. Remember the story of the 10 tribes who rebelled against Rehoboam? And Judah is the singular tribe to the south who, along with the even smaller tribe of Benjamin, simply took the name of Judah and became a tiny kingdom of what is essentially the land surrounding Jerusalem and the hills and desert to the south. And in the south, reigning from Jerusalem, is what's left of the royal line of David, or the house of David. Now, one of the things that makes this period really confusing is the fact that there are two kings named Jehoram, according to biblical scribes, reigning at the same time, one in Israel and one in Judah. Apparently, it was a popular name. Further confusion comes when you realize that a shortened alternative spelling of Joram sometimes appears for both. These alternative spellings and the initial confusion are the result of the fact that the king of Israel's actual name was originally Yaram, a theophoric name meaning Yah is exalted. The king of Judah's name was Jehoram, meaning Yahu is exalted. The names are essentially the same, as the Hebrew word Ram means high or exalted, but the theophoric element at the beginning, the name of the Hebrew God, was represented differently. Over time, Hebrew scribes, especially those who didn't like writing the personal name of God, Yahweh, simply shortened both names to Yoram, since they sounded similar and essentially meant the same thing. This is the source of the confusion. What you need to remember is that there is a King Jehoram of Israel and there is a King Jehoram of Judah, or of the house of David. Two different people, two different kingdoms, same name, same time. Now, 2 Kings 8:16 through 18 says the following. In the 5th year of King Joram, son of Ahab of Israel, Jehoram, son of King Jehoshaphat of Judah, began to reign. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. He walked in the way of the kings of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done, for the daughter of Ahab was his wife. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. King Ahab of Israel, son of King Omri, actually had an older son, Ahaziah, who took the throne after him, but he only served 1 year before dying accidentally in a fall. So his brother, Ahab's next son, Jehoram, became king. Both were children of Ahab by Princess Jezebel, the daughter of Itobal I, king of Tyre, who was given to Ahab as part of a treaty between the two nations, Phoenicia and Israel. This is why the authors of the Bible hate Jezebel so much. She was a foreigner who worshiped foreign gods, and you weren't supposed to do that. Nor were you supposed to make treaties with foreign nations. So when Israel, Jehoram, again, sometimes spelled Joram, becomes king after Ahab and Ahaziah die. Meanwhile, down in Judah, Jehoshaphat is king and getting old, and according to 1 Kings 22:44, is trying to make peace with their old cousins in Israel. So, he has his son, also named Jehoram, sometimes spelled Joram, marry the daughter of Israel's king Ahab and Queen Jezebel, Princess Athaliah, who is sister to the heir to the throne of Israel. And when Jehoshaphat dies, now we have a situation where there is a King Jehoram of Israel and a King Jehoram of Judah, both reigning at the same time, and King Jehoram of Judah is married to the sister of King Jehoram of Israel. You with me? All right. Now, King Jehoram of Judah dies of disease. So his son, Ahaziah, who is also called Jehoahaz, becomes king. Again, this is confusing because there was a King Ahaziah of Israel as well, but he's already dead. He fell off the roof. Now, Around 841 BCE, King Ahaziah of Judah and King Jehoram of Israel get together and decide to do battle with King Hazael, the new king of Aram-Damascus, who was campaigning in the north of Israel. Remember, the Tel Dan inscription says that Hazael's father had been subject to Israel. Israel had previously entered my father's land. So now Hazael is making war against Israel. So King Jehoram of Israel and King Ahaziah of Judah are teaming up to beat back this assault from Hazael and Aram-Damascus. Except things don't go well at all. 2 Kings 8, 28 and 29 say that Ahaziah, son of King Jehoram of Judah, went with Joram, son of Ahab, to wage war against King Hazael of Aram at Ramoth Gilead, where the Arameans wounded Joram, king of Israel. King Joram returned to be healed in Jezreel of the wounds that the Arameans had inflicted on him at Ramah when he fought against King Hazael of Aram. King Ahaziah, son of Jehoram of Judah, went down to see Joram, son of Ahab, in Jezreel because he was wounded. So now Jehoram, the king of Israel, and Ahaziah, the king of Judah, are in Jezreel together. The king of Israel was wounded, and the king of Judah went to visit him because they were allied together against Hazael, who was beating them in this battle. And it's at this time that something totally unexpected happens. The king of Israel's military commander, a man named Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, suddenly stages a coup and kills Jehoram, king of Israel. Jehu shoots Jehoram, king of Israel, right in the heart with an arrow. This is 2 Kings 9:24. And Jehoram, king of Israel, dies in Jezreel. And then Jehu has Ahaziah, king of Judah, shot. This is 2 Kings 9:27. And he tries to flee, but dies at Megiddo. So both kings are dead because of Jehu. Now, two things. First, Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, is not the son of King Jehoshaphat of Judah. It's a different Jehoshaphat because, the Bible wants to keep everything nice and confusing. But second, this coup by Jehu looks awfully suspicious. Not just because it's a coup and he conveniently kills both kings, essentially handing victory to Hazael while usurping the throne of Israel for himself, but because the Bible itself hints that there was some planning involved between Hazael and Jehu, a deal that would give them both something they wanted. Keep in mind that just before Jehu's coup, 2 Kings 9, 1 through 13 tells the story of how the prophet Elisha's disciple went to the army commander Jehu and anointed him as the next king of Israel. Remember, this is while Jehoram, king of Israel, is still alive. This is a usurpation of the throne, as Jehu is not Jehoram's son. He's not next in line to be king. So why would the prophet Elisha give this instruction to name a new king and basically initiate a coup? One intriguing theory was proposed by UCLA biblical scholar Bill Schniedewind in a 1996 article in Basor. He proposed that Jehu's revolt was part of a conspiracy with Hazael, king of Aram-Damascus. It's actually a pretty good theory. The kings of Israel and Judah were jointly campaigning against Hazael, particularly over the lands to the east of the Jordan. Remember, there were some Israelite tribal lands east of the Jordan River, the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh, that the Bible says had belonged to the Israelites for a brief period. These lands are obviously right in the backyard of Aram-Damascus, as well as in the territories claimed by the Ammonites and the Moabites further south. Hazael obviously wanted these lands and didn't want to engage in further bloody battles for them. Likewise, the Israelite army general, Jehu, didn't necessarily like constantly being sent into battle against Hazael and risking the lives of his troops, his buddies, against a more powerful king, especially to defend lands across the Jordan to the east, right next to Hazael's capital, which gave Aram-Damascus a huge military advantage. So it appears that Hazael, the king of Aram-Damascus, conspired with Jehu, a general in the king of Israel's army, to kill King Jehoram of Israel. Jehu would become king of Israel, and in exchange, Jehu would give up the lands east of the Jordan to Hazael, which were difficult to defend anyway. 2 Kings 10, 32 and 33 say that Hazael took all of the Israelite lands from the Jordan eastward, including all the land of Gilead, the Gadites, the Reubenites, and the Menashites. From Aroer, which is by the Wadi Arnon, that is Gilead and Bashan. So Hazael helped Jehu become king of Israel, and Hazael got land east of the Jordan in exchange, and there would be peace between Aram-Damascus and Israel. Not convinced? Want further evidence? Okay. Note that when the Bible talks about Hazael's subsequent campaigns, he avoids campaigning against Israel. Remember 2 Kings 12, 17, and 18? At that time, King Hazael of Aram went up, fought against Gath, and took it. Remember, Gath is Philistine territory. The text continues, but when Hazael set his face to go up against Jerusalem, King Jehoash of Judah took all the votive gifts that his ancestors, the kings of Judah, had dedicated, as well as his own votive gifts, all the gold that was found in the treasuries of the house of the Lord and of the king's house, and sent these to King Hazael of Aram. Then Hazael withdrew from Jerusalem. So essentially, King Hazael campaigned in Philistia on the coast and then headed up to Jerusalem. And when he got to Jerusalem in Judah, 2 Kings 12, 17, and 18 say, King Jehoash of Judah gathered up all the gold of the temple and paid Hazael off rather than be destroyed. Joash appears to have agreed to serve as a vassal to Hazael. But note that nowhere in the text does it say that Hazael campaigns against the kingdom of Israel while Jehu was king. Why? Because they likely had a peace treaty going all the way back to the very conspiracy that made Jehu king of Israel in the first place, and which made Hazael the most powerful king in the region. Meanwhile, back in Israel, Jehu cleverly gathered up all the worshippers of Baal and had them killed, so he was able to promote the worship of Yahweh, which he felt was a goal that was totally worth staging a coup and conspiring with the enemy to usurp the throne of Israel. And of course, the Bible paints this conspiracy as a good thing, as the righteous Jehu was simply wiping out the evil sons of the kings Omri and Ahab, as well as the evil foreign queen Jezebel. But I know what you're still asking. How did they pull it off? Who was the go-between for Jehu and Hazael? Here's what's truly fascinating, and what makes me think this was an actual conspiracy between Jehu and Hazael. The Bible actually hints at the entire conspiracy way back in 1 Kings 19, 15 through 17, in a weird conversation between God and Elijah. 1 Kings 19, 15 through 17 says, Then the Lord said to him, this is to Elijah, Go, return your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you, this is Elijah, shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. That's weird. The prophet Elijah is told to anoint a foreign king as king of an enemy nation neighboring Israel. Fascinating. The text continues, You shall also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel, and you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, of Abel-Meholah, as prophet in your place. And then it says this, and this is truly revealing. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill. And whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. What an odd prophecy. It's almost like someone knew, way back when they were writing First Kings, that something was up, that they were all in on this together, that there was some sort of collusion between Hazael, Jehu, and Elisha. Fascinating, right? And then skip forward to the battle pitting the kings of Israel and Judah against Hazael when King Jehoram is injured in battle. How does the general Jehu know exactly when to execute the coup against his own king of Israel? 2 Kings 9, 1 through 13 begins, "Then the prophet Elisha called a member of the company of prophets and said to him, 'Gird up your loins, take this flask of oil in your hand, and go to Ramoth Gilead. When you arrive, look there for Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi. Go in and get him to leave his companions, and take him into an inner chamber. Then take the flask of oil, pour it on his head, and say, Thus says the Lord, I anoint you king over Israel. Then open the door and flee. Do not linger.'" Essentially, once Elisha heard that the king of Israel had been injured, he told one of his disciples to go anoint Jehu as king in secret, as this was treason, and then get out of there, as you don't want to get caught up in an insurrection against the king. But how did Elisha know Hazael, king of Aram-Damascus? I mean, that prophecy from 1 Kings 19 could have been inserted into the text after the fact to explain away Jehu's rebellion. We need to remember that the prophet Elisha apparently had access to the royal court of Judah, so says 2 Kings 3:14, the royal court of Israel, 2 Kings 6:21, and to Hazael in Aram-Damascus, 2 Kings 8, 7 through 15. So the same prophet who told Hazael that he would be king of Aram-Damascus also told Jehu that he would be king of Israel, and both just so happened to come to pass. So you can say prophecy, but Elisha appears to have been an active participant in this collusion. And that, my friends, is the textbook definition of a conspiracy to usurp the throne of Israel. So the answer to our question of what does the Tel Dan inscription say is that it appears to preserve a victory boast from King Hazael of Aram-Damascus, a mid-9th century BCE king neighboring the ancient kingdom of Israel to the east, in which he credits the deity Hadad for giving him victory in battle over the defeated kings Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and over Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David. Hazael certainly wounded Jehoram, king of Israel, in battle, and Jehoram's own general, Jehu, finished him off. Whether Jehu's actions were part of a conspiracy with Hazael, we may never know. We know that Jehu took care of Ahaziah, king of Judah, which Hazael takes credit for on his end, as he was victorious in battle over the combined armies of Israel and Judah. Or, more simply put, the Tel Dan inscription is Hazael's version and his taking credit for Jehu's rebellion. That is the context of the Tel Dan inscription. Fascinating, huh? Now, let's end by talking about the one thing that most people know about the Tel Dan inscription, the reference to the house of David. These significant 6 letters, Beit Yod Tav, Dalet Vav Dalet, appear in line 9 of the inscription and are regarded as the first extra-biblical reference to the biblical King David in existence. Although there are some scholars who believe there is a reference to the house of David in the Stela, but we'll discuss that in another video. In fact, someone was so excited about these 6 Aramaic letters that they actually defaced the Tel Dan inscription by placing some white highlighting material into the inscription just so everyone can see these letters spelling out the words Beit David, or House of David, which is how the Tel Dan inscription gets its alternative name, the House of David inscription. Now, there was a time when there was actually some scholarly debate over whether these 6 letters actually said Beit David, or House of David. And by some, I mean a very little. This is because there are some schools of thought in biblical scholarship that didn't believe, or let's say that are hesitant to believe, that King David actually existed. Remember, prior to the discovery of the Tel Dan inscription, there was no evidence outside of the Bible for King David. So to many, he was just like Moses and Abraham and Adam, a myth that served as part of Israel's foundation story. However, with the discovery of the Tel Dan inscription and the acknowledgement that at least an enemy of Israel referred to Judah as the House of David 100 years after David would have lived, all of a sudden the existence of King David seemed a lot more real. Now, this didn't stop some scholars from immediately claiming that Avraham Biran, the scholar leading the excavation that made the discovery, had salted the excavation with the original Tel Dan fragment. That is, Biran was accused by some of planting a forged inscription so that he could manufacture evidence of the existence of King David, despite the fact that the fragment was found in situ, that is, in the ground, in the actual context of an archaeological excavation. A scholar named Giovanni Garbini wrote, and I quote, "The state of the fragment, the paleography, the linguistic oddities, and some ideological incongruencies induce strong doubts as to the authenticity of the Tel Dan inscription, notwithstanding the asserted discovery during an excavation campaign." Now, those forgery claims largely subsided when the next 2 fragments were discovered the following season, again, in situ. So, the conversation then turned to what the 6 letters actually said, and those who didn't believe in the existence of King David were actually coming up with anything but the obvious, Beit David, or House of David. They proposed House of my uncle, because Dalet Vav Dalet could be read as Dode, which is uncle in Semitic languages, or House of the Beloved, because Dode can also mean beloved. They proposed that Dode was the name of a deity that we hadn't heard of before in Syria-Palestine, so House of Dode, or that it was some unattested place in Canaan named Beit Dode or Beth Dode, kind of like Bethlehem. Anything but what the context and the obvious text dictate that the letters say, Beit David, or House of David. Now, another question that gets asked is why Hazael referred to Judah here as the House of David instead of simply as Judah, especially when he referred to Israel in the north and not House of Omri or House of Ahab. This is a good question. One possible reason is that Judah and House of David were practically interchangeable. Remember that Judah was very small and quite insignificant at the time. Israel was the major player. And we should remember that the Bible itself refers to the House of David 25 times. For instance, 1 Samuel 20:16, "Thus Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David." Or 2 Samuel 3:1, "There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David." This is a reference to rival dynasties. Or 1 Kings 12:19 through 20. "So Israel, the kingdom, has been in rebellion against the house of David," that is, Judah, "to this day." There's Isaiah 7:2. "When the house of David heard that Aram had allied itself with Ephraim," once again a reference to Judah. And then there's Isaiah 7:13 through 14, one of the more famous verses for Christians, the context of which is set in a reference to the house of David. Then Isaiah said, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary mortals, that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and will bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. It could also have been a matter of prestige. After all, the Tel Dan inscription is a victory stela. And so Hazael wants to make things look as impressive as possible. So while Judah might be seen as merely one small tribe, the house of David was clearly understood as the monarchy ruling a kingdom. So this reference may have been seen as more prestigious, and thus made Hazael's victory sound more impressive. So while we might expect to find Judah here in the Tel Dan inscription, we shouldn't be surprised to find the house of David to describe the southern kingdom, as the name would have been an established way to refer to the royal lineage of David and his descendants ruling Judah from Jerusalem. Now, one final issue I want to discuss is probably the most controversial, and that is whether the Tel Dan inscription is evidence that David actually existed. This is a somewhat nuanced argument, so pay attention. I would argue that the Tel Dan inscription is not hard evidence that King David existed. However, it is evidence that about 100 years after King David would have existed, an enemy king of a neighboring state referred to the kingdom of Judah as the house of David, that is, by the name of the dynasty's supposed founder. So number one, the letters Beit Yod Tav Dalet Vav Dalet do in fact say Beit David, or house of David. At this point, the only scholars trying to make them say anything else are trying to defend bad theories that died the moment those other two fragments were discovered the following year, and simply don't want to concede that they got it wrong. The inscription says House of David. The legitimate question we must still ask is whether the stories we read about a royal dynasty's founder necessarily require that founder to have been a real person if we have no other archaeological evidence about that person. The Tel Dan inscription wasn't written by David. It was written by a foreign king about a century after David would have existed. So we still have no hard evidence from David himself, only a reference to his dynasty, the House of David. The other question we have to ask is if we really think David was a historical figure, which, I will add, I do think he was a real historical figure, but based on circumstantial evidence, not hard evidence. And if we do think that David was a historical figure, did he really do all of the things described in the stories we read about him in the Bible? Or were those embellishments designed to aggrandize his legacy? I mean, the city of Rome is named after its founder and first king, Romulus, who is said to have founded the city in 753 BCE, but many people don't believe many of the stories about Romulus, like that he was the son of the god Mars, or that he was condemned to death as a baby, but that his life was spared by being hidden on the banks of a river, in this case the Tiber, not the Nile, or that he was raised by a she-wolf who suckled him, or that he later killed his twin brother Remus. There are some who believe that Romulus is completely made up, while there are others who believe that Romulus may have been a historical figure and the first king and founder of Rome, who later historians, loyal to the crown, then simply embellished over the years in an attempt to aggrandize his legacy. I think the same can be true about King David. He can be a historical figure and the founder of the Judahite dynasty, a powerful warlord and chieftain that the Judahites called a king, and yet many of the stories in the Bible about him can be, let's say, aggrandizements. Then again, I'm guessing that there are also many stories in the Bible about David that are very true. Let's say, like he usurped the throne from Saul and Jonathan, or that he watched all of his rivals to the throne get killed, but somehow it was never his fault, or that he committed adultery and ordered the murder of his mistress's husband. Those stories aren't all that flattering, and very well may be true. So I have no problem believing in a historical David. And I believe that the Tel Dan inscription actually does make a reference to the dynasty of King David of Judah. Now, that doesn't prove that he existed, but it's pretty good evidence that an enemy king thought that he did over 2,800 years ago, making it the first clear extra-biblical reference to King David ever discovered. That's what you need to know about the Tel Dan inscription. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Do you have a theory of your own? Let me know. Likewise, if you have a biblical archaeology question or an idea for a future episode, please tell me in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video, and if you found it helpful, please subscribe to this channel and click the notifications bell to stay up to speed on the latest excavator videos. I hope you learned something new, and until next time, everything the best.